If you're hoping to see the Jets make a lot of big moves in free agency, you might be disappointed by what Robert Saleh had to say yesterday. We're breaking down the offseason plans Saleh revealed today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, March 3rd, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, Robert Saleh spoke to the media yesterday for his Combine press conference. He did not speak on Tuesday when Joe Douglas addressed the media. Usually around the Combine, you see the head coach and GM speak on the same day around the same time. That did not happen with the Jets. It's not particularly unusual. Sometimes you'll only hear from a head coach or a GM. And Saleh revealed that he was sick earlier in the week, so that's why he delayed his chat with the media until Thursday. But he revealed some interesting things about the Jets' offseason plans, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the other day I mentioned that Joe Douglas really gave us nothing. Joe Douglas really kept a very quiet approach when he was addressing what the Jets were going to do. He gave a lot of cliches. And I mentioned that, sometimes these combine press conferences, these press conferences that happen before the start of free agency are a waste of time because teams usually won't give you much information in the way of what they're going to do. They're not going to reveal their plans. Saleh did give us a few interesting things. So maybe Saleh kind of reinvigorated my faith in the offseason press conference because we did learn a couple of things about the Jets' plans from Saleh. And, when I talk about the approaches to these offseason press conferences, I don't think there's a good approach or a bad approach. I mean, I don't think that your performance in an offseason press conference really translates to wins or losses. I think it's more of an individual choice. It's a stylistic thing. But I think Saleh gave us a little bit more insight as to what we can expect from the Jets. Now, I think one of these insights is probably going to disappoint you because Saleh said that we're going to be judicious in free agency, and he said that our focus is on keeping the defense together. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, it probably means that you're not going to see a lot of big splashy signings. So we know that the Jets are going to have to move around some cap space this offseason because right now they're over the salary cap. So that's a given. The question is how much cap space are they going to clear? And some of that can be done through cuts, guys like Carl Lawson and Corey Davis if the Jets want to cut them, and I don't think there's a guarantee either way on those guys. But they could do some of this through cuts. They could also do it through restructuring contracts. And there's a lot of bad information out there about restructuring contracts because I think there's this idea that it's easy, it's painless. Really, what a restructure is in most cases, now sometimes you'll hear it's a straight pay cut, and that means you're just reducing the player's salary. But otherwise, if it's not a pay cut, if the word pay cut is not in the story that you're hearing, then essentially what a restructure means is that we're kind of like putting the cap charge on the credit card. We're lowering a player's cap hit this year, but in exchange, we're raising it by the same amount in future seasons, and there's no way to get out of that. So the question is how much the Jets are going to put on the credit card. They got to put some on the credit card because there's only so many players they can cut, and they have to figure out a way to make room for a veteran quarterback who's probably going to be pretty expensive. The question is, are they really going to push a lot of cap hit to the future? And it sounds like from what Saleh is saying, the answer is probably no to that. I think Saleh using the word judicious, I think, tells you a lot. And it kind of meshes with what Joe Douglas has done in free agency through the years. Not from the standpoint that the Jets have been afraid to spend, because the Jets have been one of the biggest spending teams in the league in free agency the last couple of years. And that's actually there's this idea that Joe Douglas won't spend in free agency. That's not true. Joe Douglas has actually been very aggressive in free agency. Unfortunately, the results have not been great outside of a few exceptions like DJ Reed and Connor McGovern. But what Joe Douglas doesn't do is he doesn't give out the market-setting deals the way maybe a Mike McCagnon would have, or a Mike Tannenbaum. He's not the guy who's going to make somebody the highest-paid player at their position, importing them from another team. That's something Mike McCagnon did. It's something Mike Tannenbaum did. So again, like there's this idea that Joe Douglas is afraid to spend in free agency, which the facts just do not mesh with that at all. But Joe Douglas has taken a very quote-unquote judicious approach to free agency through the years, where he essentially sets his number and he doesn't go above it for a player. And that's, I think generally speaking, there are always exceptions. There are always guys where you go above the market rate, they actually have a big impact for your team. But for the most part, that's a pretty good approach to free agency. It would be better. Part of it's evaluating players correctly, which that's the area the Jets have struggled in recent years. But I think that that actually, I think, provided a bit of clarity that the Jets are going to, doesn't sound like the Jets are really setting themselves up to push a ton of cap space to the future and be super aggressive the way they have the last 2 seasons when they've had cap space. The other note there is that the Jets want, Saleh used the term, we're going to run it back with the guys on defense. So you think about the guys who are going to be free agents on the defensive side of the ball. You've got on the defensive line, you've got Sheldon Rankins. So Sheldon Rankins is a good player, and I have to say that he really impressed me this season, because a year ago, I thought the Jets should cut him for the cap space. If I recall, last year it would have saved the Jets around $5 million of cap space. He came back and had a good season. Now, in fairness, I think that there was, sometimes I get stuff wrong. I got that one wrong, but I think that that's not particularly an egregious one. If you wanted Rankins cut a year ago, there were good reasons to want Rankins cut a year ago. He did not have a good 2021. His first season with the Jets was not good. This year, I don't know whether he was finally fully healed from the Achilles injury he suffered in 2018. Maybe it was just the other pieces on the Jets defensive line were helping him out. Maybe he just, sometimes a guy just has a great season on his own. Rankins had a good season, so I'd be happy to have Rankins back. At linebacker, the Jets have a couple free agents, Quan Alexander and Quincy Williams. And my views on these guys are kind of split. Quan Alexander, if the Jets can bring him back for a cheap deal, I thought he gave the Jets good value. For what the Jets paid him, I was pretty happy with what Quan Alexander provided. I remember the offseason, I think it was in the summer, the Jets signed him, and the reaction was a bit over the top. You would have thought the Jets had signed Brian Urlacher from the way some folks were talking about it, but what I was hoping for Quan Alexander was a guy who would improve depth, a guy who could play a limited number of snaps and play effectively. I think that's what the Jets got. So if they can bring him back, I don't have a problem with that. The other linebacker who's a free agent is Quincy Williams, and I'm going to upset a lot of people because my view on Quincy Williams is different from a lot of people's views. I think Quincy Williams is a good player to have on your team. I think for what the Jets got him for as a waiver claim, he provided excellent value. I think on his rookie contract, he was an asset for the team. But I think he's the type of guy where if you have him on a rookie contract, you're very happy with what you get. Once you get up to like the $8, $9, $10 million range, he's not such an asset because there are a lot of mistakes on his game. And the other thing about Quincy Williams, and I think this is the reason I'm probably in the minority on this, is that it's like you can see when he makes a big play. He delivers a big hit. He flies over the field. He's got speed. He has assets that he brings to the table. Whereas I feel like when he fails, the failures are a little bit more subtle because the broadcasters don't do a good job of explaining or showing you like when a guy fails to fill the gap or when a guy overruns a play. I feel like that's one of the failures of the way the NFL broadcasts its games. So I understand, if you want Quincy Williams back, I wouldn't mind Quincy Williams back at a certain price, but I feel like he's going to make too much money. However, if you are a fan of Quincy Williams, I feel like you're going to be much happier than I am because I think the Jets really want him back. All the buzz from media sources has been that the Jets, Jets love Quincy Williams. They think he's got Pro Bowl potential. So don't get mad at me. I mean, you're probably going to get your way. You're probably going to be much happier than I am with the way things play out. And then the last free agent is LaMarcus Joyner, who I don't know if Saleh was talking about LaMarcus Joyner. I mean, I think the Jets probably know that they should not bring him back, at least as a starter. I mean, look, LaMarcus Joyner's at the end of his career. He had to settle for a cheap one-year deal from the Jets last year. I guess if they brought him back as a backup, that would be fine, but they certainly should not bring LaMarcus Joyner back as a starter. So pretty moderate approach from the Jets. It sounds like they're going to focus on just retaining their own guys, and I mean, I think that there are positions where they need upgrades. I mean, the positions where there are free agents, when we're talking linebacker, when we're talking safeties, those are spots the Jets could use an upgrade. So on paper, like, defense is good. And I don't think, listen, the linebackers and safeties did not prevent the Jets from having a very good defense this year. So I'd like to see them upgrade those two spots. I'd like to see them up like one blue chip player at one of the two spots. I think that could take the defense to the next level. But we know that this defense is based around the line, based around corner play. So it's not. I guess it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to go crazy over it. So that's kind of what the first indication Saleh gave us when he spoke to the press yesterday. The second was at the quarterback position. He gave us a lot of the generic cliches about Derek Carr, but he told us something about depth that was interesting. As we continue here on this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll discuss what Robert Saleh said about Mike White and the Jets potentially bringing him back. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat but you don't want all the fat and calories? Then you have to try Built Bar. What makes Built Bars so good? Well, for starters, they're all covered in 100% real chocolate. Yes, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors, delicious flavors, churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond. And it's tough to say how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And they're healthy. Most of them only have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, I've been telling you about ordering your Built bars at Built.com. Well, of course you can still do that, but if you want them a little bit quicker, you can go to your local Walmart or Sam's Club. So head to your nearest Walmart today. You can walk into the pharmacy section. You can grab yourself a box of Built Bars. They'll have 4 bar boxes of cookies and cream, double chocolate or coconut puffs. Or go into Sam's Club. Grab yourself a 13 bar box of hit flavors like brownie batter or churro. And you can also order them still at Built.com, Built.com. Built Bars, delicious protein bars that taste like candy bars. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. We're talking Robert Saleh's comments yesterday because Robert Saleh, when he spoke to the media ahead of the NFL Combine, gave us actually some interesting insights as to what the Jets are thinking this offseason. And he talked about the Jets being judicious in free agency. He talked about the Jets desiring to bring back their key defensive players. But he also talked about the offensive side of the ball, in particular the quarterback position. Now, he gave Derek Carr a lot of compliments, no surprise there, the stuff you would expect. But he also talked about Mike White. And Mike White's, of course, about to hit free agency. Mike White had an opportunity to seize the starting job near the end of the season, unfortunately got injured and did not play very well in a loss to the Seattle Seahawks Week 17, which eliminated the Jets. But Saleh said that Mike White, and this was what he said was, the words were, he should be on the roster. And Saleh also noted that the Jets kept 3 quarterbacks last year for much of the season. So that's worth noting, because it sounds like from those comments, sometimes these comments about, oh, we like a guy, it's generic. And I think that's what Saleh did with Derek Carr when he spoke yesterday. But Mike White, the fact that he specifically noted that the Jets kept 3 quarterbacks on the roster, that's notable. Now, I don't expect Mike White's going to cost a ton of money for the Jets. I think that, there was a scenario where he could have, if he had, when he took over the starting job, if he had led the Jets to the playoffs, then we'd be having a different discussion. But we also might not be discussing the Jets bringing in a quarterback if that was the case. Mike White, I think, has proven that he's a pretty solid backup. He can go out there and have a big game. In fact, in his first start of 2021 and his first start of 2022, he played excellent football. And one of those was against the Bengals team that went to the Super Bowl. The other was against the Bears team that wasn't very good and was playing a backup quarterback itself. But, Mike White's shown that he can go out there, he can play a big game for you. I think his flaws over the long haul kind of limit what he can do. The accuracy isn't quite there. And for whatever reason, he just has as much as he, every year he has one game where he plays great. I mentioned this, his first start of 2021, 2022 were both very good. His last start of both years were awful. The game against Buffalo where he threw 4 interceptions, and then the Seattle debacle where, he certainly wasn't the only problem, but did not play anywhere close to well enough at the quarterback position. I think there's logic behind bringing back Mike White from another standpoint, and that's if Zach Wilson's back. Now, Zach Wilson is a guy the Jets, it sounds like they want to keep him. I think if they got the right trade offer, if they got like a Sam Darnold package where they could recoup a 2nd-round pick, maybe even a 3rd-round pick, they probably would send Zach Wilson out of town. But the way I view it is this. you're never going to get the second overall pick of 2021 back. You're not going to be able to use it on Jamar Chase. You're not going to be able to use it on another player. Like, that pick is gone. So it's pointless to despair over that pick. And it's pointless to say that Zach Wilson needs to play because he's the number 2 overall pick. That's a sunk cost. We've lost that pick no matter what. I think that, generally speaking, you always have some sort of developmental quarterback on your team. Sometimes he's on the practice squad. Sometimes he's on the active roster. So I think Zach Wilson right now is the developmental quarterback for the Jets. 2 years ago, they thought, he was worth the second overall pick. There are clear physical tools there. He doesn't have much else mastered, though. So my view of this is that you keep Zach Wilson essentially as the developmental quarterback, and you try and work with him on the practice field, and who knows, maybe you can get something out of him. I mean, I think that the hopes of Zach Wilson justifying the second overall pick are probably gone. The talk of the high ceiling, I don't know if there's really a high ceiling at this point. If Zach Wilson turned into a credible backup, if Zach Wilson turned into a Mike White type quarterback, at this point, that would probably be above the expectation. That's just because developmental quarterbacks typically do not pan out. The expected contribution is very low. Why do you have a developmental quarterback? Because when he does pan out, it's a big deal for your franchise. So one roster spot is not much to dedicate to a developmental quarterback. But if you got a developmental quarterback, that probably means that you don't want him to play because you're not really helping him. And you kind of saw that at the end of the season when the Jets had to play Zach. It just did not go very well. And it's particularly that Thursday night game against Jacksonville. The Jets had benched him, and in some ways it kind of felt like they were benching him for his own good after the game in Foxborough where Wilson played terribly and answered that question in the post-game press conference poorly. It was a spot where it felt like the Jets were just kind of doing it for his own good, though, where they felt like they were not helping his development by being on the field. So you don't want to put him on the field, which could mean that you bring him back as the number 3 quarterback, and essentially you work with him on the practice field. And this essentially, it doesn't guarantee it because sometimes you do get down to your third quarterback, but it makes the odds lower that you will end up with Zach Wilson needing to play. If you have 2 guys in front of him, then he probably will be able to spend the rest of the season the full season on the practice field. And you can work with him. And you have a solid backup in Mike White, a guy who can win a game here for you at least. So to me, it's logical. Now the question is whether the Jets can afford it, because Wilson is cheap for a starter, but for a depth quarterback, he's fairly expensive. And you're probably bringing in a fairly expensive veteran. So the question is, how much can you dedicate to the quarterback position cap-wise? And there are probably ways you can maneuver cap hits around. You can structure deals in a way, just as I spoke about in the first segment. You can structure deals and restructure deals to figure out how you want to fit guys into your salary cap situation. But it's worth considering. So I guess that is the one caveat there. But I see the logic in the Jets bringing back Mike White as the backup if they can afford him. And with that said, I think White's going to get a raise. He may not get a huge raise, though. It might be a situation where the Jets can afford it. So I think that makes sense for the Jets. We'll see what happens going forward. But it's interesting that Saleh specifically mentioned Mike White. And ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about something else Saleh discussed. Saleh talked a little bit about the offensive coaches, a couple new guys the Jets brought in, and how he envisions them. And we'll talk about that as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We're talking about some information Robert Saleh gave us yesterday. Saleh, for an offseason press conference before the start of free agency, actually was pretty informative, for whatever it's worth. And again, I don't think that this is necessarily anything that's that important. I don't think how you handle a press conference is good or bad. I think it's just more of a stylistic thing. It's more of a philosophical thing, how much you want to reveal. Saleh gave some indication about the way the Jets are going to approach the offseason this year, but he also talked a little bit about the way he envisions the coaching staff moving forward. And he gave some insight into Nathaniel Hackett. He talked about how he kind of implied that Hackett would be a guy who would get along with players. And I got the sense from, if you listen to his comments, he was kind of tacitly suggesting that maybe Mike LaFleur struggled a little bit in relating to players. At least that's my theory. That's been my theory. And based on it, he did not exactly say that, but he was asked about some of the changes with Hackett coming in instead of LaFleur, and he kind of talked about Hackett's personality, how he's easy to get along with, and I think the implication there might have been that LaFleur had a little bit of difficulty getting along with players. But I think the big note there is we talked about Todd Downing. who the Jets brought in as their passing game coordinator. And Saleh indicated that Downing's going to work a lot with the quarterbacks. And Downing's got a lot of Downing's got a lot of experience. He's worked with a number of veteran quarterbacks in the past, including Derek Carr. And this is notable for me because I think it kind of explains something. Now, early in the offseason, the Jets indicated they had fired their quarterbacks. There was a report that came out. The Jets did not indicate it. There was a report that came out that the Jets had fired their quarterbacks coach, Rob Calabrese. Apparently, that report was erroneous because Calabrese is coming back. And there was a lot of questions about that. And I think not unfairly. I think partially because, the young quarterback, Zach Wilson, did not succeed. And it's not always fair, but when the young quarterback fails, typically the position coach goes. Beyond that, the offensive coordinator obviously went with the Jets. So, if the offensive coordinator had to go, why did the quarterback's coach get to stay? That was not entirely clear at the time. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure it's entirely clear at this point. But it's almost like a situation where it sounds like Todd Downing, the Jets have done what's known as layering. They essentially didn't fire Calabrese, they did not demote him, but they essentially put a supervisor in over him. That's kind of like what it sounds like the Jets did here. And the Jets talked in the offseason, especially at the outset, about how they wanted to bring in an experienced coach to kind of oversee things. It was the role Matt Cavanaugh held in 2021. It was the role the Jets envisioned for the late Greg Knapp before he tragically died in a horrible accident in 2021. Saleh indicated that he wanted the Jets to have a veteran voice on the offensive side of the ball. Now, part of that may have been Nathaniel Hackett, because, of course, Hackett has plenty of experience working in this league. Hackett has plenty of experience running offenses in this league. But based on what Saleh said, it kind of seems like Todd Downing is the guy the Jets brought in for that specific role. So it's kind of like Downing will supervise Calabrese, that he'll work directly with the quarterbacks. And in all honesty, I don't know that the quarterback's coach, I think the other aspect of this is, I don't know that the quarterback's coach is as important when you have a veteran quarterback, because he's more, I think it's more of a partnership in most cases with a veteran. So you just want somebody you can work with, somebody who could be a sounding board. It's not like you have Zach Wilson or Sam Darnold, where they still need to learn some of the fundamentals of the position, and both of them really struggled in those areas. And you can debate how much the coaching had to do with that and their overall failures to improve. But Downing, it sounds like he's kind of like the new supervisor there. So if you were wondering why Rob Calabrese is still around as the quarterback's coach, and you still may be wondering because it's difficult. I don't think Zach Wilson's failure is really entirely on Rob Calabrese, but I also don't think there's anything Rob Calabrese did that was all that special based on what we've seen. But the indication is that it seems kind of like Todd Downing's been brought in to run the quarterback. So it seemed like a bit of an interesting note from Saleh, and maybe explains the way the Jets view their coaching staff hierarchy. That may interest you or it may not, but I found it noteworthy. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, big thumbs up, helps the channel out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll be back on Monday to talk more Jets.